In 1847, Félix d'Anjou discovered the Dijon Tonary. This manuscript dates from the early 11th century and is preserved in Montpellier. The manuscript has 322 pages. Since its discovery, the manuscript has gained a lot of attention for various reasons. It has a double notation, pitch letters over 2 octaves and corresponding unhidden neumes. This made it a kind of Rosetta Stone for the decipherment of traditional neumes. Unlike most manuscripts, the chants are not organized according to the liturgical calendar, but according to mode, first note, and highest note. Moreover, it is by far the oldest manuscript in which we can read the intervals of the Mass repertory. In 1851, Théodore Nisser published a precise transcription of this manuscript. He discovered the 5 special signs that this paper is about. Comparison with other manuscripts made it immediately clear that the signs are always on the subsemitonal positions. Here you see all the pitch letters and the 5 signs in between with their corresponding positions on the staff. I will show the signs on the staff as hollow notes. Nisard considered the signs alternatives for the subsemitonal letters. In 1880, Joseph Poitiers also saw it that way. Poitiers, however, thought there must be an obvious explanation for them. Based on Nisard's transcription, in 1854, the classicist Alexandre Vincent launched the hypothesis that the signs refer to quarter tones. This hypothesis has subsequently been repeated and further substantiated by many. I mention François Raillard, Joseph Gmelch, Manuel Pedro Ferreira, and Leo Lausberg. The hypothesis has become the standard interpretation. In this paper, I will do 4 things. First, I will show that all arguments presented for quarter tones are invalid. Second, I will show that the signs do not have a rhetorical function, but a melodic one. Third, I will show that the semitone was a problematic interval before the standardization of staff notation. Finally, I will substantiate my interpretation of the signs. They warn to intonate the subsemitonal tones high enough. In one word, uphold. In 1854, Vincent based his argument for quarter tones on the word adjutor in the gradual tibi domine. In Nisard's transcription, you see on the syllables of this word E sign, and sign F, respectively. Below you see the graduale novum with the signs as hollow notes. Because the first 2 signs represent the last note of a pass, they refer to a note higher than E. Because the 3rd sign represents the first note of a pass, it refers to a note lower than F. If the signs refer to the same notes, they must therefore be between E and F. That is the reason for Vincent's microtonal interpretation. This is how this would look like. But as early as 1855, Stephen Morelot pointed out that adjutor is unique in the entire manuscript and also has corrections. Here you see the original. There are different opinions about these corrections. However, the fact that adjutor is unique is much more relevant. Independent of the way you interpret the corrections, the signs in this passage can be interpreted in at least 3 ways. As quarter tones, as part of a unisono pass, and as a mistake. Because there are no further indications for quarter tones in the manuscript, this is the least likely of these options. But there are numerous examples for the other 2. various cases of unisonopes and of errors. The first argument, therefore, must be rejected. Vincent agreed and focused on the second argument. Yet this first argument was presented again and again by Gmelch, Ferreira, and Lautsberg, among others. The second argument concerns the supposed correlation of the signs with the quarter tones of the Greek enharmonic genus. This diagram illustrates this very well. The diagram can be found in Nancy Phillips' handbook. It is even shown on the Wikipedia page of the Dijon Tonary. But this diagram is misleading. There is no distinct correlation between the signs and the quarter tones. The tables of Alypius, in which the signs of the Greek scales can be found, contain dozens of signs, but only 4 of our 5. The vocal scales contain even only 3. Peter Wagner already saw this. Moreover, the signs in these scales do not represent the quarter tones, but rather the third tones of the tetrachords, that is, the D and the G in the diatonic genus, and the top notes of the so-called pyknon in the chromatic and enharmonic genus. Furthermore, the signs can only be found in the lower tetrachords. In my opinion, therefore, this diagram is wishful thinking. Vincent referred to theorists such as Boethius, Ptolemy, Plato, Pythagoras, and especially Marcetto of Padua and Guido of Arezzo. Several medieval authors wrote about supposed microtones, but they can always be interpreted in terms of intonation or tuning. Almost always they refer to Boethius, the monochord, and the impossibility to divide the tone into 2 equal parts. This is probably the reason Gmelch already dismissed them. Manuel Pedro Ferreira found only 4 authors who referred to chant itself: Isidore of Seville, Pseudo-Remigius, an interpolator of Guido of Arezzo, and Jerome of Moravia. Apart from the interpolator, none of these refer to a specific chant. For the interpolator, there are many interpretations. Manuel recently added even a new one. Yet it is clear that the interpolator can also be interpreted in terms of intonation. That, for example, is what Fred Schneiderberg did. Also, the passage in question contains no special signs or neumes. The passage can even be interpreted as ornamental neumes. So there is no argument that unambiguously links the special signs to the quarter tones of the enharmonic genus. The third argument was put forward by François Reillard in 1859. He noted that the gradual of Cluny has special neumes that often correspond to the signs in Dijon. Therefore, Cluny would also refer to quarter tones. In 1996, Ike de Loos showed that something similar applies to a gradual from Utrecht. In 2012, Manuel Pedro Ferreira clearly showed that this also applies to manuscripts from Ake, Stavelot, and Trier. The similarities between these manuscripts are indeed clear. However, they do not provide a valid argument for quarter tones. They only show that both the signs and the special neumes point to the same phenomenon. But that phenomenon could be something completely different. In fact, the horizontal last note that is typical for these neumes suggests that you should pay attention to intone this note high enough. That is exactly what my interpretation proposes. That horizontal note could also indicate unisono, something we often find in corresponding places in other manuscripts. The third argument, therefore, is also invalid. In 1911, Joseph Gmelch introduced two new arguments. The first, or fourth, is based on the relative diastemacy. Sometimes the traditional neumes clearly sketch pitch. Gmelch gives some examples with neumes over signs that suggest these signs represent higher notes than the subsemitonal notes. In this example, that indeed is the case. However, this is not a general rule. There are countless counterexamples. Here you see just three of them. This argument, therefore, is also invalid. Gmelch's other argument is based on the order of tractuli and virgas. According to Gmelch, the virga between two tractuli indicates a higher tone than the adjacent tractuli. That, indeed, is often the case. Then he shows some cases where there is a special sign under the virga with corresponding subsemitonal notes under the tractuli. But here again, there are numerous counterexamples. In the second example, the virga in question even indicates a lower note. This fifth argument, therefore, is also invalid. This means that all arguments put forward in favor of quarter tones are invalid. The logical conclusion from this is in line with Nissard, Poitier, and Forget. Look for a different interpretation. In fact, Finn Egeland Hansen and Fred Schneiderberg looked that way. They did not talk about quarter tones, but respectively about a slightly shortened version of the normal tones and a comma increase, both of which come close to my uphold. With some examples, I will now show, contrary to what Leo Lausberg thinks, that the signs have a melodic function and not a rhetorical one. Here you see the text of the offertory Terra Tremoid. I have marked the syllables that have special signs. In the third verse, there are 5 nouns: cornu, arcum, scutum, gladium, and bellum. Of these, 2 have a sign, arcum and scutum. Rhetorically speaking, that choice seems arbitrary to me. In my opinion, it is not defensible that these 2 words should be underlined for posterity and the other 3 not. Here you see the offertory Benedicite Gentes. You only find signs in the last verse. Is the rest rhetorically less important? And why signs on ore and clamavi and not on lingua and exultavi? That, again, seems arbitrary to me, not something to preserve for posterity. There are also 7 offertories that have no signs at all. Does that make them rhetorically less important? My final example is Benedictus es in labiis. Here we see 30 syllables with signs, so 30 places where, according to Leo, people are invited to meditate on the content of the text. That is very often in a single chant. Is it possible to meditate with so much push? Also, those places seem to be very random. I think the melodic context of the signs gives a much better explanation. My analysis shows that 98% of the signs are in the same melodic context, namely always between 2 super semitonal tones. This basically was also noted by Vincent, Gmelch, Barali, and Forget. This context can therefore be seen as a necessary condition for the placement of signs. When we underline all syllables that meet this condition, we get the following for terra tremuit. Here we see that of the 5 nouns, only arcum and scutum meet the condition. So those are the only words that can have signs. In Benedicite Gentes, we see that the condition is fulfilled almost exclusively in the 3rd verse. That's where the signs are. In Benedictus S, we see many syllables where the condition is met. About half of them have a sign. If we take all the offertories together, we get the same picture. In about 40% of all cases where the condition is met, there is a sign. The question then arises why there are sometimes signs and sometimes not. This brings us to the substantiation of my interpretation. The signs are always on the sub-semitonal positions. Why is that? It is known from ethnomusicology that the size of the semitone can vary in time and place. In folk music from the Balkans, you can tell where someone is coming from by the size of the semitone. We can also see this in the notated Gregorian sources. In the southwest and in the 9th century, you see much more mi and si than in the northeast and in the 12th century. In my opinion, this is the result of regional differences in the size of the semitone. Ultimately, these differences consolidated in the 14th century into the German dialect in the east and the French dialect in the west. It can hardly be a coincidence that the manuscripts with special neumes come from the border between these regions. They seem to explicitly warn to maintain local intonation. Medieval theorists speak almost exclusively about Pythagorean tones and semitones, but we know that there are different tones and semitones. We see this even today. Greek, Byzantine, Turkish. Some medieval travelers talk about practical problems with the semitone. Abbot Amo from Friesland, for instance, saw great friction with his mother monastery in Prémontré and said, "They also sing the semitone with a very inflected voice." A certain Rudolf from Liège even complains that he cannot properly notate the melodies from St. Truiden on lines. This not only indicates that the semitone was larger in the south, but also that there probably were other tones within the semitone. Here, this is clearly suggested by the friction between the neumes of Laon and the pitches of Dijon. Various embellishments simply did not fit line notation. We specifically see this with Porrectus, Trichon, Tristropha, and Orescus. Rayer already saw this in 1859. Typically, these are the places where we find the signs, as if to warn you between all those microtones to intonate the subsemitonal tones correctly. The offertories make up 1/3 of the size of the Dijon Tonary. I compared all signs of the offertories with the places where the melodic condition for signs is met. This comparison showed 3 things. 1. The signs appear 3 to 5 times more often before tone repetitions than similar places without signs do. There are basically 2 types of tone repetitions: normalized ornaments and recitations. 2. The signs appear 2 to 3 times more often on the last note of a word or phrase than similar places without signs do. Froger already saw this. 3. There is a tendency towards more signs in melos that is less standard. This is evident from the classification of offertory parts in 6 different traditions. My interpretation of the special signs, therefore, is they warn to intonate the subsemitonal tones high enough. Uphold to local intonation. This is especially relevant before normalized microtonal embellishments and subsemitonal recitations, but also at the end of phrases and when the melos is less familiar. It's all a matter of attention. Thank you.